2. There is an abstract machine of language that does not appeal to any extrinsic factor. If in a social field we distinguish the set of corporeal modifications and the set of incorporeal transformations, we are presented, despite the variety in each of the sets, with two formalizations, one of content, the other of expression. For content is not opposed to form, but has its own formalization, the hand-toll pool, or the lesson of things. It is, however, opposed to expression, inasmuch as expression also has its own formalization, the face-language pole, the lesson of signs. Precisely because content, like expression, has a form of its own, one can never assign the form of expression the function of simply representing, describing, or averring a corresponding content. There is neither correspondence nor conformity. The two formalizations are not of the same nature. They are independent, heterogeneous. The Stoics were the first to theorize this independence. They distinguished between the actions and passions of bodies, using the word body in the broadest sense, as applying to any formed content, and incorporeal acts, the expressed of the statements. The form of expression is constituted by the warp of expressts, and the form of content by the woof of bodies. When knife cuts flesh, when food or poison spreads through the body, when a drop of wine falls into water, there is an intermingling of bodies. But the statements, the knife is cutting the flesh, I am eating, the water is turning red, express incorporeal transformations of an entirely different nature, events. The genius of the Stoics was to have taken this paradox as far as it could go, up to the point of insanity and cynicism, and to have grounded it in the most serious of principles. Their reward was to be the first to develop a philosophy of language. The paradox gets us nowhere, unless, like the Stoics, we add that incorporeal transformations, incorporeal attributes, apply to bodies, and only to bodies. They are the expressed of statements, but are attributed to bodies. The purpose is not to describe or represent bodies. Bodies already have proper qualities, actions and passions, souls, in short, forms, which are themselves bodies. Representations are bodies too. If non-corporeal attributes apply to bodies, if there are good grounds for making a distinction between the incorporeal expressed to become red, and the corporeal quality red, etc., it has nothing to do with representation. We cannot even say that the body or state of things is the referent of the sign, in expressing the non-corporeal attribute, and by that token attributing it to the body. One is not representing or referring, but intervening in a way. It is a speech act. The independence of the two kinds of forms of expression and forms of content, is not contradicted but confirmed by the fact that the expressions or expressts are inserted into or intervene in contents, not to represent them but to anticipate them or move them back, slow them down or speed them up, separate or combine them, delimit them in a different way. The warp of the instantaneous transformations is always inserted into the woof of the continuous modifications, hence the significance of dates for the Stoics. From what moment can it be said that someone is bald? In what sense does a statement of the type, "There will be a naval battle tomorrow," constitute a date or order word? The night of August 4th, July 4th, 1917, November 20th, 1923. What incorporeal transformation is expressed by these dates? Incorporeal yet attributed to bodies, inserted into them. The independence of the form of expression and the form of content is not the basis for a parallelism between them or a representation of one by the other, but on the contrary a parcelling of the two, a manner in which expressions are inserted into contents, in which we ceaselessly jump from one register to another, in which signs are at work in things themselves, just as things extend into or are deployed through signs. An assemblage of enunciation does not speak of things. It speaks on the same level as states of things and states of content, so that the same X, the same particle, may function either as a body that acts and undergoes actions, or as a sign constituting an act or order word, depending on which form it is taken up by. For example, the theoretico-experimental aggregate of physics. In short, the functional independence of the two forms is only the form of their reciprocal presupposition, and of the continual passage from one to the other. We are never presented with an interlinkage of order words, and a causality of contents, each in its own right, nor do we see one represent the other, with the second serving as referent. On the contrary, the independence of the two lines is distributive, such that a segment of one always forms a relay with a segment of the other, slips into, introduces itself into the other. We constantly pass from order words to the silent order of things, as Foucault puts it, and vice versa. But when we use a word as vague as intervene, when we say that expressions intervene or insert themselves into contents, are we not still prey to a kind of idealism in which the order word instantaneously falls from the sky? What we must determine is not an origin, but points of intervention or insertion in the framework of the reciprocal presupposition of the two forms. Both forms of content and forms of expression are inseparable from a movement of deterritorialization that carries them away. Both expression and content are more or less deterritorialized, relatively deterritorialized, according to the particular state of their form. In this respect, one cannot posit a primacy of expression over content, or content over expression. Sometimes the semiotic components are more deterritorialized than the material components, and sometimes the reverse. For example, a mathematical complex of signs may be more deterritorialized than a set of particles. Conversely, the particles may have experimental effects that deterritorialize the semiotic system. A criminal action may be deterritorializing in relation to the existing regime of signs. The earth cries for revenge and crumbles beneath my feet. My offense is too great. But the sign that expresses the act of condemnation may in turn be deterritorializing in relation to all actions and reactions. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. Genesis 4:12. You cannot even be killed. In short, there are degrees of deterritorialization that quantify the respective forms and according to which contents and expression are conjugated, feed into each other, accelerate each other, or on the contrary become stabilized and perform a reterritorialization. What we call circumstances or variables are these degrees themselves. There are variables of content or proportions in the interminglings or aggregations of bodies, and there are variables of expression, factors internal to enunciation. Germany, toward November 20th, 1923, on the one hand, the deterritorializing inflation of the monetary body, and on the other, in response to the inflation, a semiotic transformation of the Reichsmark into the Rentenmark, making possible a reterritorialization. Russia, toward July 4th, 1917. On the one hand, proportions of a state of bodies, Soviets, provisional government, and on the other, the elaboration of a Bolshevik incorporeal semiotic, accelerating things and contributing to the action of the detonating body of the party. In short, the way an expression relates to a content is not by uncovering or representing it. Rather, forms of expression and forms of content communicate through a conjunction of their quanta of relative deterritorialization, each intervening, operating in the other. We may draw some general conclusions on the nature of assemblages from this. On a first, horizontal axis, an assemblage comprises two segments, one of content, the other of expression. On the one hand, it is a machinic assemblage of bodies, of actions and passions, an intermingling of bodies reacting to one another. On the other hand, it is a collective assemblage of enunciation, of acts and statements, of incorporeal transformations attributed to bodies. Then, on a vertical axis, the assemblage has both territorial sides, or re-territorialized sides, which stabilize it, and cutting edges of deterritorialization, which carry it away. No one is better than Kafka at differentiating the two axes of the assemblage and making them function together. On the one hand, the ship machine, the hotel machine, the circus machine, the castle machine, the court machine, each with its own intermingled pieces, gears, processes, and bodies contained in one another or bursting out of containment. See the head bursting through the roof. On the other hand, the regime of signs or of enunciation, each regime with its incorporeal transformations, acts, death sentences, and judgments, proceedings, law. It is obvious that statements do not represent machines. The stoker's discourse does not describe stoking as a body. It has its own form and a development without resemblance. Yet it is attributed to bodies, to the whole ship as a body. A discourse of submission to order words, a discourse of discussion, claims, accusation, and defense. On the second axis, what is compared or combined of the two aspects, what always inserts one into the other, are the sequenced or conjugated degrees of deterritorialization and the operations of reterritorialization that stabilize the aggregate at a given moment. K. The K function designates the line of flight or deterritorialization that carries away all of the assemblages, but also undergoes all kinds of reterritorializations and redundancies of childhood, village life, love, bureaucracy, etc. The tetravalence of the assemblage. Taking the feudal assemblage as an example, we would have to consider the interminglings of bodies defining feudalism. The body of the earth and the social body, the body of the overlord, vassal, and serf, the body of the knight and the horse and their new relation to the stirrup, the weapons and tools assuring a symbiosis of bodies, a whole machinic assemblage. We would also have to consider statements, expressions, the juridical regime of heraldry, all of the incorporeal transformations, in particular oaths and their variables, the oath of obedience, but also the oath of love, etc., the collective assemblage of enunciation. On the other axis, we would have to consider the feudal territorialities and reterritorializations, and at the same time the line of deterritorialization that carries away both the knight and his mount, statements and acts. We would have to consider how all this combines in the Crusades. It would be an error to believe that content determines expression by causal action, even if expression is accorded the power not only to reflect content, but to react upon it in an active way. This kind of ideological conception of the statement, which subordinates it to a primary economic content, runs into all kinds of difficulties inherent to dialectics. First, although it may be possible to conceive of a causal action moving from content to expression, the same cannot be said for the respective forms, the form of content and the form of expression. We must recognize that expression is independent, and that this is precisely what enables it to react upon contents. This independence, however, has been poorly conceived. If contents are said to be economic, the form of content cannot be said to be economic, and is reduced to a pure abstraction, namely the production of goods and the means of that production considered in themselves. Similarly, if expressions are said to be ideological, the form of expression is not said to be ideological and is reduced to language as abstraction, as the availability of a good shared by all. Those who take this approach claim to characterize contents and expressions by all the struggles and conflicts pervading them in two different forms, but these forms themselves are exempt from struggle and conflict, and the relation between them remains entirely indeterminate. The only way to define the relation is to revamp the theory of ideology by saying that expressions and statements intervene directly in productivity in the form of a production of meaning or sign value. The category of production doubtless has the advantage of breaking with schemas of representation, information, and communication, but is it any more adequate than these schemas? Its application to language is very ambiguous in that it appeals to an ongoing dialectical miracle of the transformation of matter into meaning, content into expression, the social process into a signifying system. We think the material or machinic aspect of an assemblage relates not to the production of goods, but rather to a precise state of intermingling of bodies in a society, including all the attractions and repulsions, sympathies and antipathies, alterations, amalgamations, penetrations, and expansions that affect bodies of all kinds in their relations to one another. What regulates the obligatory, necessary, or permitted interminglings of bodies is above all an alimentary regime and a sexual regime. Even technology makes the mistake of considering tools in isolation. Tools exist only in relation to the interminglings they make possible, or that make them possible. The stirrup entails a new man-horse symbiosis that at the same time entails new weapons and new instruments. Tools are inseparable from symbioses or amalgamations defining a nature-society machinic assemblage. They presuppose a social machine that selects them and takes them into its phylum. A society is defined by its amalgamations, not by its tools. Similarly, the semiotic or collective aspect of an assemblage relates not to a productivity of language, but to regimes of signs, to a machine of expression whose variables determine the usage of language elements. These elements do not stand on their own any more than tools do. There is a primacy of the machinic assemblage of bodies over tools and goods, a primacy of the collective assemblage of enunciation over language and words. The articulation of the two aspects of the assemblage is affected by the movements of deterritorialization that quantify their forms. That is why a social field is defined less by its conflicts and contradictions than by the lines of flight running through it. An assemblage has neither base nor superstructure, neither deep structure nor superficial structure. It flattens all of its dimensions onto a single plane of consistency, upon which reciprocal presuppositions and mutual insertions play themselves out. The other mistake, which is combined with the first as needed, is to believe in the adequacy of the form of expression as a linguistic system. This system may be conceived as a signifying phonological structure or as a deep syntactical structure. In either case, it is credited with engendering semantics, therefore a fulfilling expression, whereas contents are relegated to the arbitrariness of a simple reference, and pragmatics to the exteriority of non-linguistic factors. What all of these undertakings have in common is to erect an abstract machine of language, but as a synchronic set of constants. We will not object that the machine thus conceived is too abstract. On the contrary, it is not abstract enough. It remains linear. It remains on an intermediate level of abstraction, allowing it to consider linguistic factors in themselves, independently of non-linguistic factors, and to treat those linguistic factors as constants. But if the abstraction is taken further, one necessarily reaches a level where the pseudo-constants of language are superseded by variables of expression internal to enunciation itself. These variables of expression are then no longer separable from the variables of content with which they are in perpetual interaction. If the external pragmatics of non-linguistic factors must be taken into consideration, it is because linguistics itself is inseparable from an internal pragmatics involving its own factors. It is not enough to take into account the signified or even the referent, because the very notions of signification and reference are bound up with a supposedly autonomous and constant structure. There is no use constructing a semantics or even recognizing a certain validity to pragmatics if they are still pre-treated by a phonological or syntactical machine. For a true abstract machine pertains to an assemblage in its entirety. It is defined as the diagram of that assemblage. It is not language-based, but diagrammatic and superlinear. Content is not a signified, nor expression a signifier. Rather, both are variables of the assemblage. We get nowhere until the pragmatic, but also semantic, syntactical, and phonological determinations are directly linked to the assemblages of enunciation upon which they depend. Chomsky's abstract machine retains an arborescent model and a linear ordering of linguistic elements in sentences and sentence combinations. But as soon as pragmatic values or internal variables are taken into account, in particular with respect to indirect discourse, one is obliged to bring hypersentences into play, or to construct abstract objects, incorporeal transformations. This implies superlinearity. In other words, a plane whose elements no longer have a fixed linear order, the rhizome model. From this standpoint, the interpenetration of language and the social field and political problems lies at the deepest level of the abstract machine, not at the surface. The abstract machine, as it relates to the diagram of the assemblage, is never purely a matter of language, except for lack of sufficient abstraction. It is language that depends on the abstract machine, not the reverse. At most, we may distinguish in the abstract machine two states of the diagram, one in which variables of content and expression are distributed according to their heterogeneous forms in reciprocal presupposition on a plane of consistency, and another in which it is no longer even possible to distinguish between variables of content and expression, because the variability of that same plane has prevailed over the duality of forms, rendering them indiscernible. The first state relates to still relative movements of deterritorialization. In the second, an absolute threshold of deterritorialization has been reached.